we're in the relieving of suffering at the small level, but at the big level, we're evolving consciousness. So we have to evolve our own consciousness first. Welcome again to the Wild Psychotherapists. In this episode, John and I explore the wider context of therapy, the stories and beliefs we tell ourselves, and the social forces that impinge on the practice of psychotherapy. So, as a taster, let me tell you an old story. One day, an angel and a devil were deep in discussion about humanity as they fluttered gently around the lower levels of heaven. They argued and argued about the fate of human beings. Would we humans ever reach enlightenment and stop making so many mistakes? Looking down to earth far below, the angel spied a person bending over. Look, look, she says. They found a grain of truth. Human beings will be saved. The tempter glanced down, waved his wing dismissively and shrugged. It doesn't matter a single bit. They may have found a grain of truth, but before you know it, they'll turn that grain of truth into a rigid belief system. In this video, we tend to wander around the topic, so please forgive the choppy editing. I'm told I should invite you to subscribe and like us. I really don't know what that does, but it sounds good. We particularly enjoy comments, questions, and suggestions, and we do listen. Thank you.
I think it would be useful to have a conversation about what informs our practice, what models we might use.
I actually say to beginning therapists is, what's your model of human beings? If you don't have a model of human beings, how can you have a model of how human beings change? And what it means to be a true human being, what it means to be yourself, if you like, rather than somebody else. So I wonder, what's your model of human beings?
Mine.
Mm-hmm.
I will sometimes, not often, but sometimes I'll say to a client that we all maybe do or don't have stories about what it's all about, what life's all about. But it's probably quite good to kind of talk about our stories, or I can say what my story is, and you can say how that resonates with one that you haven't articulated, but it might help you move towards speaking about that or articulating it or reflecting upon that for yourself. Shall I say what my story is?
Tell me, what's your story?
Okay. Well, there's this remarkable universal energy that it might even be beyond the word energy, this subtle force of creation that everything comes out of and everything goes back into, and it permeates the life of all entities, all beings, and it keeps us alive. As long as we're alive, then we're still on track. But if our bodies die, or if for whatever reason that energy is knocked out of us or leaves us, then we're just dissolving back into that remarkable field of essence. And it probably means that we disappear like we do every night when we go into deep dreamless sleep. And when we go into deep dreamless sleep and disappear every night, we kind of get refreshed by that total disappearance from being John or Roland or whoever we are. And without that, we would get ill. Without that total disappearance, we would get really ill. It's like beyond dreams. So if we think about, say, some of that energy coming into a conception, whether I'm a raccoon or a hedgehog or a fox or a mole or a slug or whatever entity that force comes into, some of that life gets locked into that journey of that particular entity, that being. The fact that this has come into my ancestor, my mother's fertilized egg, I was then locked in. And I'm part of this remarkable, I'm a representative really of this remarkable universal energy. But until we realize that and get ourselves back from the over adaptation to our culture, to our family, to our ideas about ourselves, about others, our projections, that all of that can blind us totally from this remarkable pure potentiality that we really are. It's usually some sort of difficulty that we encounter in life that takes us to therapy. That we're disillusioned with um, that false self or that limited self, and we're haunted by a longing to kind of be more of who we really are instead of what we've been through. And then, when in therapy, if we have a trusting, really good relationship, we can start to grow up again, from where we got stuck in the razor wire of that developmental glitch or glitches or over adaptations. We get to kind of, whether we like it or not in that environment, we get to start to grow up again. And the therapist is a sort of facilitative environment person for you to almost feel like you've got a confidential, lifelong confidential framework to begin emerging again into the mystery of who you really are. And then you're up and running.
Well, it's beautifully put, actually, John. You've obviously practiced this.
I say it to myself often. It's almost like when you say this, when I learned this for myself, it felt
Mhm.
true. And
Mm.
if I say it to clients and they didn't have a story, but they are keen to say, well, I kind of resonate with that story. That story sounds pretty good to me.
It's a lovely story, I have to say. And I like the fact that it's a story. Of course, my mind is tricky, which is that I have all sorts of different stories. It just depends. So I love your story. In fact, I could almost agree with every single bit of it. The only bit that I would start to wonder about, which is like, do we disappear? And what disappears if it disappears? So when we're asleep, as you're saying, we're having this experience, and we're not conscious, but we're being. We're not being in the way that our ego normally is. We're not having
Mm,
conscious experiences. But I'm
mm,
just thinking about last night. I had a lot of stuff going on last night. I don't remember it. I do remember that it had meaning because I knew at the time that it had meaning, but I don't have any kind of way of holding that information.
mm,
So that makes me wonder about, well, do we disappear completely? So that's the only question I would have you. And that would be a difference in viewpoint. Do we merge back into the oneness of this universal energy? Or is there some core essence which isn't our normal ego identity, but is
mm,
a sense of the bigger self, in a Jungian term, which has some continuity? In the sense that energy has continuity, and I'm sure this is a Buddhist thing, which is if you light a candle and you light another candle, you light a candle, the flame is the same. Or if we have every single cell in our body changes in 7 years or whatever it is, are we the same person? Well, the pattern remains, but the elements don't remain. So, is there a pattern or a process beyond our kind of sense of individuality which has continuity? So that's the main question I would have that's different from yours. All the rest I'd go very much with, and I've been reading a lot of Taoism at the moment.
mm,
I'm a Taoist for the moment, and that sense in which there is this universal, it's not even an energy, it's a kind of a patterning or a shaping of the universe, which comes from deep, deep from somewhere which we can't even say. If you're a scientist, you'd talk about the laws of the universe. But, in Chinese philosophy, it would be that there's this underlying patterning in the universe and that we're part of it and that there's no separateness. The story that
mm,
I tell myself is that whatever I believe is wrong, that's my story.
mm,
So start with that premise because that seems to be more or less the best I can get to. It's not wrong in the sense that it's bad, it's wrong in the sense that it's incomplete. And that all of our beliefs are incomplete and sometimes misguided. And it's those which actually take us into places where we shouldn't be. I do believe there's this essential energy, a kind of, if you go into Chinese philosophy, it's called Ren, and I don't know how to pronounce it, but it's the essential humanness of us, our essential nature, and that humanness is something we aspire towards rather than what we have just because we're born into a body that's human. And that I think of psychotherapy in its biggest sense as the evolution of humanity, of humanness in myself as a therapist and in my clients. And they will start from a place of suffering, and then they'll move through a process of self-awareness and insight. Eventually, they'll come, most people, but not everybody, to a place of transformation where their story is one which is much bigger than just that small story of themselves. Everything has its inherent nature, like a hedgehog has its nature, or the bunnies that I look at and I was watching this morning. It's just, they're just so wonderful. Or a magpie. A magpie's nature is not like a bunny's nature. And human beings have a general nature and then a very specific nature to do with each individual. And that is what needs to be expressed. And just as you said, it gets covered up by all sorts of terrible things which happen to people.
Mm,
And also by the misguided nature of our society, the limitedness in the way we're schooled, we're taught, the
mm,
things in the media, all of this covers up our nature. Uncovering that is the process of therapy.
mm.
And you have, how does that happen? Well, it has to happen in relationship because human beings are relating. They have to relate. So it's that primary relationship with somebody who, in some sense, stands in for your better self. I stand in for the future self that that person can become. You only have to be two steps ahead of them on the path, and then you can be of help. You don't have to be very far. It's just as long as the view you have is more positive than the view they have, then you can help them.
We're still babies as a species. We're really, you know, we've done a runner from our earliest development as a species into a world of just growth and there are so many remarkable things that humans have developed and explored and created, but um, overall, we've left nature behind in most respects, and like so many species are, almost, well, some species have disappeared, and there's more at risk. But if you think about the possibility, say, of us living in harmony with nature,
Mhm.
that idea is almost impossible because if we started to live in harmony and from our side, and nature started to kind of develop and become the wild came back into the foreground, our species numbers, diminished somewhat, maybe even greatly, and then the wild was allowed to be the wild. It would not try to live in harmony with us. It doesn't have the same need almost to live in harmony with us. It would consume us if we didn't find a way to almost like protect our boundaries and deal with nature as it impinged on us in all sorts of ways. And I think that problem that humans have had a pretty ropey relationship with nature in terms of controlling it, destroying it. We'd have a lot of learning to do to manage our numbers, to live more, letting the wild be the wild, trying to think about other species, have their feelings, not just walk all over them or knock them over in our path, but show a lot of respect. And even
Mm.
though we might have to, kill or eat, that we could do it with a lot more respect and maybe not in the same sort of magnitude that we do because of our numbers.
Oh,
So
we're kind of slipping into a whole nother area, aren't we? Which is our relationship with nature. if we take it back to psychotherapy, it's like, what is the nature of human beings? Is the nature of human beings to be aggressive, to be dominant, to be controlling? Is that our nature? Or is it to be loving, to be altruistic, to be relating? Or is it everything of that? And I think, as a gardener, as you know, it's a big issue to me as a gardener, which is how much do I allow nature to take its course and how much do I impose my will on nature? And this is there's never a solution to that. There's never a kind of resolution. When we start to think about our relationship with nature, it's incredibly complex. And I don't think we've evolved enough to understand it and
I
to
think you're
understand how to do it well. It wasn't a problem when, we had a very limited technological society. It wasn't a problem. We weren't destroying as much as we are. We weren't abusing it. We weren't using it, consuming it. Um, but we are. And every human being is taking more than they give. Is our nature, our inherent nature, as somebody asked me, is it good?
I think it's essentially potentially good. There's a lot of I find Buddhist psychology very helpful in terms of thinking that we have what they call the three poisons of ignorance and confusion, which is one thing, and desire, which is like a grasping, possessive quality, and aversion, which is like in some ways like it's projecting negative things onto life or onto the world around us. And they're all to do with kind of attempts to control, almost like a first impulse that arises from those three features. If we can get a handle on those and have awareness in relation to those, then we're much more in a position to kind of negotiate with the world. I like the interface between Buddhist psychology and developmental psychology. And Donald Winnicott, was a remarkable man for talking about being, but also talking about the need for there to be a kind of holding field developmentally, that a child is seeking this field of love and this attunement and this resonance that is constantly amplifying the remarkableness of life in a safe environment for the child. And the child then comes into that field that the mother creates or the father creates in a way that's participating in the wonderment of that life, of pointing out instructions like what's that, what's that, what's that. So there's a learning impetus that in the field of love can become both inner and outer, to do with inner forces to do with greed, or to do with impulsivity, or to do with grasping and wanting. And we're in some ways, the growing up process can be a civilizing process, but it also can be a crippling one. And when it is a crippling one to some extent, even in part, then that has effects on the whole personality and how the personality forms. And so, but there's still this alive, this seeking, this wanting for a relational home with in a good space with another, where that can almost like be explored, and also for there to be a spilling out of the stories of suffering and of struggle. And some of that will happen of its own accord once the safety is formed in a therapeutic relationship.
So, is therapy trying to promote the goodness of human beings? That there is inside every human being this yearning, if you like, for the whole, for something to be more complete,
Mm,
and that gets distorted through whatever reasons as we grow up. And then therapy is trying to re-evoke that or help it develop and evolve because maybe it's
mm.
still quite primitive, but that we're actually in the business of human evolution.
Yeah. And individual, collective, relational, family, community, it's all trying to strengthen and, as you say, facilitate. It's like there's something already there that wants to have more expression.
Mm.
But first, the the suffering and the fixity, the rigidities of character and over-identification almost need to be loosened through a kind of exercise within relationship of different muscles.
As a Buddhist practitioner, do you assume that the things like desire, greed, anger, the things, the hindrances, that they are built into human beings? Are they part of our fundamental nature, or are they something that we've kind of accumulated or that have happened to us?
I think they represent a level of our being that doesn't go away, that we kind of grow up through it. I think Ken Wilber's model, or the spiral dynamic model,
Mhm.
is very helpful in terms of both understanding how humans have developed historically, but also how every child develops. You go beyond and include the previous levels, like the most primitive levels that you're pointing to, which is more about survival and self-preservation. The chakra system kind of points to the same kind of territories of there being a kind of survival energy field within us. And then there's a kind of growing up through a potential of the magic and the mythic, becoming a somebody and having enough of that magical wonderment of a protected environment as a child that you develop a resilience to kind of keep on going upwards instead of getting locked into one level. Well, I mean, all of us can be locked in some ways to a level of lower rational thinking. And then our center of gravity is locked into a lower field of struggle and confusion and fear and anxiety, and also grasping and impulsivity. All sorts of life potential can't be lived through easily. We can't keep on learning and growing if we're locked into that lower rational position.
Okay, so I have a little model which I use for myself, which is kind of obviously close to a Buddhist model, but I think of what I call either shadow ego or ego demons. And
Mm-hmm.
they go from control, the need for control. Our ego is designed to control
Mm-hmm.
because it's designed to help us survive. It's judgment. We are designed, if you like, our ego is designed to judge things, to evaluate things, but it gets out of control. These aren't necessarily negative things, but they get out of control. Another one is being special, the specialness that I am special and I'm more special than anybody else, which of course is a core kind of egocentric way of thinking. But that seems to be built into babies even, because babies, they require that the universe responds to them rather than they respond to the universe. And they are special, but some people don't grow out of that. And, then that's narcissism. But we all have some of that because we are
Mm-hmm.
the center of the universe in the sense that I look out and there is the universe around me, and I am this point in the center of the universe. So that specialness. And the last one I always think, which kind of clinches it all, is self-deception. That human beings have an incredible capacity for self-deception. I'm sure I'm doing it to myself at this very moment. And
Mm-hmm.
probably you are too. The major self-deception that people have is that they're going to live forever and they're never going to die. I mean, that's a crazy one. That is the strangest thing that people live as though they're not going to die. It's so much of it deceptive. Haven't been able to recognize that this is a kind of clinging onto some security, some belief system.
We
Uh,
don't have many role models who are wise, really.
no, we certainly do not, and certainly not in the political field. There's a few of them in the more religious field.
Yeah, there are. But I don't know if there are any in the political world. There are some aspiring to that in the political world.
So,
I was
there
thinking,
are other people out there.
yeah, no, I was thinking when I was traveling, across borders this past week that there were so many people demonstrating kindness in the way that they helped each other in different ways, little ways. And, for me to find my way and ask somebody if they spoke English.
Mhm.
And there was so much kindness, really. And I thought there's a lot of this in the world, actually. But in some ways, what we lack are leaders who will try to really work at this level instead of going to war or becoming reactive, or that they have vested interest because they're greedy and they're seeking power or money. There's a sad sad something going on in that hierarchy and the way it's evolved. Power leads to corruption very easily. But there are so many kinds. There's so much kindness that goes on in the world, which warms my heart.
I know it's always amazing if you travel, particularly in certain countries, although it's very cultural how kindness is expressed.
There's a lot of immediate sort of curiosity and warmth and sharing and dialogue. So it depends, I think, on where you are and how you're meeting people on what level.
So that goes back to the human nature, which is I do believe that in general, people are kind and considerate if they're given the opportunity.
Mm,
That doesn't mean that they also can't be mean and withholding in other situations, but they need the opportunity. And I've always liked that the Buddhist idea that you beg in order to give the other person the opportunity to be generous. If you're a Buddhist monk, you know,
yeah.
and that is a great gift to people to allow them to be generous
Mm.
because it's something which is in them, but they don't necessarily have a means to express that.
There's something in kindness and a lot of our earliest life experiences in the womb and then in mother's arms, and that relationship allows almost like that feminine territory within ourselves, that kindness to almost potentially move into a much stronger place if we have that early life experience. And not just, I mean, I even see people who've had very horrendous experiences that they're still capable of kindness.
We tend to think of that as a more female quality, not in the sense of it's to do with women, but that it's to do with the receptivity. And I was just reading some more Taoist stuff about yin and yang. And of course, in a Chinese philosophy, those are immensely complicated concepts. They
Mm,
are nothing like we tend to think of them in the West. And then
mm.
what about the action aspect of the opposite of compassion? We've been talking about kindness and compassion and the softer aspects of relationship. What about the dynamic aspects of relationship?
And what do you mean by dynamic?
Well, aggression, assertiveness. I just have this image of you cutting down your hedge. You can't just look at the hedge and compassionately ask it to cut itself. You have to get in there with your, and you have to go at it. The relationship between you and that hedge is very dynamic.
Yeah, and I think in how I want to keep it alive. I don't want to destroy it. And I also want it to be a certain size so can keep on managing it, not get too tall or too wide. And I have to think about boundaries between my property and other people's property. So there's lots of dynamic features that's to do with considering your context. But if I think of dynamic in relation to those features like aggression or assertiveness, I think they're forces to be reckoned with as wisely as possible. And the learning to do that, again, like if I relate that to therapy, like I think people expect a hospitable receptivity when they come to therapy the first time. A lot of people are anxious. And so to provide a welcoming, safe place that's nice to come into, both environmentally and the kind of way you are in that welcoming. It's like a longing. People long to have that, and they know it when they have it, and they know when it's not there. Even little things. Remember a client, the water in the vase in my therapy room was a bit milky. For that client, seeing that milky watered vase, she said, "Is that how you're going to treat me?" You
She said that to you.
know,
That's a very astute
So,
observation.
but it taught me a lot just in terms of how little things matter, and how individual people are, and therefore to cover all the bases, it's got to be a really good environment in all sorts of ways so that it almost like covers anybody, that people like a cozy, warm, tidy, receptive place that can be pleasing to come into. Like,
But the idea of this welcoming container, the
uh,
womb, and I can't remember what the Jungian term is, but you're creating this space which has got some boundaries, it's got some shape to it. And but within that, there's this sense of possibility of things can happen because, if you like, it's filled with love, or as much as
Mm.
possible filled with love. But then, can you have a relationship with a therapist who is not relating to you because their model is of unrelationship?
I think people have also a remarkable capacity to make do and also be compliant.
That's true.
And also people have a lot of capacity to live off scraps.
That is very true, actually.
Unless you make it very clear that you welcome protest or questions, people can say, I don't like this, or what about that? Unless they can protest or challenge and question, unless you really proactively value it and welcome it, then a lot of people will live off scraps.
So, do you think that some therapy is scrappy?
Well, I'm impressed with how people sell their therapy can be very unscrappy. And then the therapy itself can be a kind of a part experience. It's not a whole experience. It's a particular problem solving process where they go into partnership with the client. And if that works, that experiment works, then it's got a kind of a piece in it that's going to be useful to that person developmentally or just as another experience. So you could say that some people need that in relation to particular features, and that's what they come for. They don't necessarily want to come for a much more all-embracing relational experience. It's like the frequency of therapy too is like that. Some people want to come, weekly, 3 weekly, monthly. Some people come every couple of months.
And some people
And
come twice a week, 3 times a week if they could.
yeah, money sometimes is the issue.
Oh, it's a big issue. And that's it's an issue which is not talked about in therapy very much by therapists, which is like this is a very expensive investment.
Mm.
It costs a lot of time, of energy, of attention, and of money.
Mhm.
It's very expensive in those kind of things. And it has to be thought of as a one of a major investments in your life. It's more expensive than buying a car sometimes.
Ideally, therapy should be free.
I agree. It should be free, although you have to have an exchange. It can't be completely free.
Oh, there you go. That's too definitive for me. It could be completely free.
What is the exchange then?
I think it is the exchange of learning and meaning making together, and also working things through, when you can have a relationship where you can work through even difficulties that arise within that relationship. There's a growth element in it for everybody.
But I'm sure you've had the experience of, having a sliding scale with some clients, and then they want to pay you more.
Yeah. Mm, no, I haven't had that experience. Yeah, I like the idea of everybody being taxed more, and then a lot of these services are free, so that there's a kind of equality at the level of mental health and of well-being, that there's something that is assisting everybody equally.
But here, of course, what you have is basically a market environment. You have a capitalist market environment. Therapy is a product or
Mm.
a service like any other things within the market. So here, there's a competitive element to psychotherapy and psychotherapists. It's very much an individualistic kind of situation.
But where we're going, in terms of hopeful, there should be some way that things are more not equal, but that there's not so much of a split between the rich and the poor.
Absolutely. At this level of this time in human evolution, where we deceive ourselves into assuming that that's how it has to be, or that's
Mm.
how it always will be. From a human point of view, from what I would call a real human point of view, it's completely wrong.
And I think a good example of that, how it's hard to trust a politician. There's shallowness that creeps in to, hierarchies where money at the top has led to a lot of greed. And so there's less of a care about everybody else. and not very positive. Our place in the world and other species. It's
Do you want to wrap up then? Do we do what we did last time? What have we been talking about and where have we got to?
okay. That's a good question. Well, there's something for me about the bigger context of a therapist existing within a world that's very complex, and that we ourselves, have to try to see where our own ethical impulse is alive and well within our practice, and how much we make ourselves also available to people at all levels of society as much as possible. I think the philosophy of what it's all about, it does kind of interface Buddhist psychology and developmental psychology in terms of how important relationship is, both in terms of how we lose our mental health and how we lose our fluidity within our character and over adapt. And then it's also the way out. Relationship is the way we can, in some ways, break those spells and break those limitations and move into a different sort of freedom and fullness within our lives. So I think we've kind of more gone into the context.
That's a very nice summary because I was just thinking about it, which is it's like when you're thinking about yourself as a therapist and you're thinking about your client. I always think, this person comes to me and they're suffering. My job is to be the most effective way in which they can relieve their own suffering. I can't relieve their suffering. That's my first job because suffering doesn't help people unless it's for something. So there's that kind of like focused in. It's like looking at the small aspects and why is it like this, the intricacies.
Mm,
But if you don't pull all the way back and look at what is it that we're doing as therapists, how does that fit with the social context? How is it meant to be? What would be an ideal situation? And what is it that human beings are moving, evolving towards? Because I'm very interested in the evolution of consciousness and self-awareness, because we're not going to change our bodies much because we've adapted the environment to our bodies, but there has to be an evolution of consciousness. It has to be something that is happening in our awareness, in our sense of understanding, just as you say, and relating to the wholeness of things. Because if we don't do that, we will go extinct. Something will happen, disease, whatever, wars, whatever, and it'll just kind of wipe us out. So I think that as therapists, we have to be really involved with the kind of compassionate aspect of relieving suffering, but we
mm.
can never forget the big context, the big view of things, of how do we fit into this universe. And of course, that to me is a spiritual question as well as a question of our relationship with nature. We're in the relieving of suffering at the small level, but at the big level, we're evolving consciousness. So we have to evolve our own consciousness first.
Good reason for people who are studying to be therapists to be in therapy.